Welcome to our talk, One Glitch to Rule Them All, Fault Injection Attacks Against the AMD Secure Processor. Today, we're going to present our attack against the AMD Secure Processor that allows us to execute custom payloads on that security-sensitive microprocessor. So before going into details about our attack, I want to briefly introduce the AMD Secure Processor and what it does. So I've taken this slide from an AMD slide deck, and AMD says about their secure processor that it's a dedicated security subsystem. And actually, this is an ARM core, which is integrated into your x86 SoC. So if you buy a modern AMD CPU, you not just have the x86 cores, but also there is a tiny ARM core embedded within that CPU. And it runs an proprietary and largely undocumented operating system, which is provided by AMD. And the secure processor in general is the hardware root of trust of all modern AMD CPUs. So there are several applications that you might know that depend on this secure processor. So on the server side, we have the secure encrypted virtualization technology, or SEV. This is present only on the Epyc server CPUs. SEV aims to protect virtual machines in untrusted environments by protecting their memory. So in that scenario, the secure processor is responsible for key management. So in a previous paper, we published some works of us that show what happens if there are firmware issues within that secure processor's firmware and how they affect the SEV technology. So if you're interested in that, have a look at our paper called Insecure and Proven Updated. Now on the desktop side, so on Ryzen and on Threadripper CPUs, there is a dedicated secure OS, which is running on the secure processor. And one of the applications that it hosts is a dedicated firmware TPM. So if you use a firmware TPM on an AMD system, your firmware TPM will be executed on the secure processor. And the secure processor also allows for using the secure processor as a trusted execution environment. So AMD published patches to the Linux kernel that indicate that in future versions, it might be possible to deploy user-controlled trusted applications to that secure processor. Although I'm not too sure to what extent the currently available firmware already supports this. Now, the secure processor has its own operating system, so a firmware essentially. And as it's an ARM core embedded within the x86 SoC, it's interesting to see where this firmware actually comes from. And actually, the firmware for the secure processor is part of the usual UEFI image. So if you dump the content of a flash chip from a motherboard, or if you download a UEFI update for your system, one of the things that you find inside that UEFI image is the firmware for the secure processor. And it uses a dedicated file system, like a proprietary file system from AMD. Now, we wrote a tool which is called PSP Tool, which allows you to parse that proprietary file system and dump information about the contents of that file system. It's called PSP Tool. It's available on GitHub. Now, for this talk, I'm not going to go into details about how this firmware actually looks like and what are its components. But if you're interested in that, you can have a look at one of our previous talk, which we gave on the 36C3 in 2019, where we go into much more details on the secure processor's firmware. Instead, today, I want to give you a brief overview on the secure encrypted virtualization technology, as it's one of the applications that really depend on the AMD secure processor. So I'm sure you all have heard this term that the cloud is just someone else's computer. So if you look at one of the hosts of a cloud system, you will find that there's a high privileged component called the hypervisor, which is responsible to host multiple virtual machines from potentially different tenants. And the hypervisor will ensure the isolation of these different virtual machines in this environment. Now, if you as the customer or user of such a VM want to protect your data in this environment, you can use disk encryption technologies, for example, and that will protect the data which is stored on a block device, so the data at rest. You can also use technologies like TLS to protect the data which is transferred over a network. But if you consider the hypervisor as the adversary, the data is unprotected. So the data in use, which is residing in the virtual machine's memory, is not protected by anything. So the hypervisor can have direct access to the memory content, including the keys for disk encryption or the TLS connection. Now, the SEB technology tries to solve this problem by adding memory encryption to virtual machines. So with SEB, a virtual machine's memory is encrypted, and the respective encryption keys are held by the AMD Secure Processor. The hypervisor has to use a specific API, which is implemented by the SEB firmware running on the Secure Processor to instantiate new virtual machines. And then the Secure Processor will generate fresh virtual machine encryption keys. And from there on, the virtual machine is protected. So the hypervisor has no longer direct access to that machine. Now, if you consider the remote system as not fully trustworthy, such as a cloud environment, for example, the SEB technology allows you to prove or to verify that your virtual machine was instantiated the way you specified it. And it implements or it offers a remote attestation feature that allows a customer, for example, to verify that the virtual machine is deployed on a genuine AMD system with SEB protection in place. And all of this remote attestation protocol and the handling of the virtual machine's memory encryption is implemented by firmware running on the Secure Processor. So if you're interested in attacking SEB, the Secure Processor is an interesting target. So now we start with faulting the AMD Secure Processor. How can we actually attack the Secure Processor by injecting a fault? In general, fault injection attacks mean that you modify the environment of an integrated circuit so that it will not crash, it will continue to execute, but you changed the behavior of that IC. So for example, you could lower the voltage for a short period, which is referred to as voltage fault injection. You could hit the IC with an electromagnetic pulse, which is referred to as EM fault injection. Or you could hit it with a laser, which is referred to as laser fault injection. Now, regardless of the way you introduce a fault in the system, you have certain properties that you want to achieve as an attacker. So imagine there's a security-sensitive check that will validate some password that was entered by the attacker. Now, the attacker does not have the password, so the system will transition into an error state if the password check failed. Now imagine we're able to introduce a fault during this validation. So there are a number of things that can happen. So for example, we could just lock up the system. So we somehow lowered the voltage too much, the system is no longer functional, we have to reset it to try again, for example. Or you directly reset the system, right? You lower the voltage and then rise it up again, and the system simply restarts. Or you just have no effect, meaning that the system will still enter the error state, although that's not what you actually wanted. Or anything can happen, actually. But also, one of the possibilities that can happen is that the system will actually allow you access. So the error you introduced during the security-sensitive check causes something that transitions the system into the authentication successful state here. So the key takeaway here is that with fault injection, there are many, many different states which you can reach with that attack, but only one is useful. So in this case, only this is the useful state that we want to reach here. And the key challenges with fault injection in general are, first, you need to have some kind of trigger. So you need to understand and identify when the target is in a state where it's performing something security sensitive, like a password validation. And you need to know the parameters to which extent you want to change the target's environment. So if we're talking about voltage fault injection, you need to know how deep you want to lower the voltage so the system is still operational, but the behavior has changed. And you need to determine whether your attack was successful. And also, in case it was not successful, you need to be able to quickly reset the system and then try again. Because most of the times you would try a fault attack, the effect will not be that you gain access, for example, right? So the system might crash or whatever. Just a minor fraction of the attempts will result in a successful attack. So you need to be able to quickly reset the system and try again. Now, to do that on the AMD Secure Processor, we need to understand how the AMD Secure Processor actually works and how its boot is protected. So when you power up the AMD system for the very first time, the first thing it executes is the ROM bootloader. The ROM bootloader is, as the name says, a bootloader which is executing from non-updatable ROM. And the thing that the ROM bootloader does is it will initialize the system and then will load an AMD public key from the SPI attached flash. It will verify that public key by hashes which are stored within the ROM bootloader. Now, in the second step, the ROM bootloader will load the PSP bootloader component. And that component has a signature, and the ROM bootloader will validate that signature using the public key, which was loaded in the first step. Now, the execution is handed over to this PSP bootloader component, and that component will load additional components or additional applications from the SPI attached flash. And they all have a signature, and the PSP bootloader will validate their signature using the public key that's loaded in the first step. So during runtime, this PSP bootloader is actually like a small operating system running in the privileged SVC mode, whereas all the applications are running in the unprivileged user mode. Now, we looked at this first step that the ROM bootloader does, the loading of this AMD public key here. Now, using a logic analyzer, we analyzed what happens on the SPI bus during this step. And what you see here is the output of that logic analyzer during loading of the AMD public key. Specifically, you see the chip select line of the SPI bus and the MISO line, that is the data coming from the flash to the CPU. Now, we replaced this AMD public key with our own public key on the SPI flash, and then recorded the same point in time during the ROM bootloader's execution. And this is the trace that you see there, the red part. Now, as you can easily see, it kind of looks the same for both attempts, except for in the end. So in the case of the original AMD public key, you see here that there's continued SPI activity. Whereas in the case of our own public key, you see that there is no more SPI activity at this point in time. Now, from that, we actually concluded that during this window, what you see here, the AMD public key is verified. And also what we saw is that the number of chip select level changes before this window is constant. And afterwards, the chip select line is always pulled low unless the verification of that key failed. In that case, it will stay high. So now we have the chip select line that we can use as a trigger to determine when we want to inject a fault, namely during the key verification. And we also can use the chip select line to determine whether our attack was successful or not, because only if the public key was accepted, the chip select line is pulled low again. So we use that information to trigger our attack and to measure success. Now, on a high level, our attack works as follows. Our goal is to execute payloads right after the ROM bootloader. So in the first step, we replace the AMD public key in the UEFI image with our own public key. Then we replace the PSP bootloader with our payload. Then we sign that payload with our custom key. And then we introduce an error during this window where the public key is verified, so that the secure processor is forced to accept our public key and then use that public key to validate the signatures of our payload. Now, to actually inject an error during this window, we need to understand how the input voltage to the AMD SoC is handled. So modern x86 CPUs use, in general, dynamic voltage control. So on AMD SoCs, there's a dedicated component, a small microprocessor within the AMD SoC called the System Management Unit that is responsible to monitor the whole SoC and to determine by some logic which input voltage should be applied. Now, the System Management Unit talks to the to an external voltage regulator using the SPI2 bus. Now, the SPI2 bus allows to control two different voltage domains. On Epyc on Ryzen systems, we saw that there's usually one voltage regulator, which is responsible to handle VSOC. That is the input voltage where the AMD Secure Processor is attached to, and also vCore, where the x86 cores are attached to. On Epyc systems, we saw that there are two voltage regulators, one for each voltage domain. Now, these voltage regulators are microcontrollers which are part of your motherboard. So they're not part of the AMD SoC. And now I'm going to hand over to Niklas, who's going to explain how we can use that setup to actually manipulate the input voltage to the AMD Secure Processor.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So the setup we use to inject a fault is inspired by the Vault Pillager attack, which has been published earlier this year. And what they do and what we also do is we attach a TNC microcontroller to the bus between the voltage regulator and the AMD SoC. And the TNC microcontroller can inject packets here and tell the voltage regulator to apply different voltages to the voltage rails, in our case, to VSOC. Additionally, we need to be able to reset the system in between attempts. That's why we attach our TNC microcontroller also to the ATX reset line of the motherboard. And furthermore, as Robert explained, to have our trigger and to determine whether or not our attack was successful, we connect the TNC microcontroller to the SPI bus, also present on the motherboard. Then the TNC microcontroller runs the attack logic, but is controlled by an external machine that has a script that supervises the attack. The setup looks really nice and clean here on the slide, but in reality, it looks something like this. So you can see here a desk in our department that has been set up like this for at least 1 year now. And in the top, you can see two Ryzen motherboards that we use for testing. And in the bottom, large server motherboard with an Epyc CPU. And we can actually control the whole setup remotely. And you can see the attack machine that we use on the top left here. Let's zoom in a little bit into the Epyc motherboard. You can see this small board that we attach to the RAM slots here is actually connected directly to the SPI2 bus. And it has a little driver IC on it that helps us inject packets onto the bus. And it's connected via the breadboard here to the TNC microcontroller. And the TNC microcontroller is similarly attached to the SPI bus over here. You can see there's also a little external dongle with an external flash chip so that we can easily replace the flash contents via USB from our attacker machine. The last piece in the puzzle is this dodgy looking wire here, which connects the TNC to the ATX reset line. So now that we've seen the setup, let's go through one cycle of our glitch attack. You can see here logic analyzer traces. At the top two traces are the clock and data line from the SPI2 bus. Afterwards, you can see an analog trace of the actual voltage being applied to the AMD SoC. And on the bottom, you can see two chip select lines, one from an attempt where our attack actually succeeded, and one from an attempt where the key was rejected. First of all, this is right after the system has been reset. The SVD, so the data line of the SPI2 bus is low, and it becomes high when the system starts to boot. You can see there's two packets being injected by the CPU onto the SPI2 bus, which set some default voltages. Our TNC notices this and starts with the attack logic. And you can see also the two packages that the CPU injects here actually cause the voltage of the VSOC to rise immediately. Afterwards, there's some activity that you can see here on the clock line, which would potentially interfere with our packets being injected. And this activity is the voltage regulator sending telemetry data back to the CPU. In order to avoid collisions, we disable this telemetry reporting feature by injecting our first 2 packets some time after that. You can see here we wait for a telemetry report, and right afterwards we inject the packet. We do this 2 times here to once set the core voltage that we know and the sock voltage that we predetermined, and we also disable this telemetry reporting feature. Now the TNC waits, and we wait until the AMD SP starts to access the flash, which looks something like this. So here the AMD SP starts to load some directories and then finally starts to load the AMD public key from the flash. And our TNC can count the chip select process and knows exactly when it's done loading the public key. And at this point, we perform the actual attack. To do this, the TNC injects 2 packets. One will lower the voltage level of the VSOC rail to a really low level. And then you see the VSOC voltage starting to fall here. And then before it reaches this really low level, the TNC ejects a second package, which sets a higher voltage again. So that you have this really nice defined dip here with a defined low point. And yeah, and now you can also see that this point is exactly inside of the key verification window. And now we hope for the best. Use the chip select line again to determine whether or not there was some more activity, so our attack succeeded, which is the lower case here, or if we're in the higher case where nothing happens on the SPI bus and we pull ATX reset low again and restart the whole attack. Overall, we've successfully applied this attack to all Epyc and Ryzen CPUs that we got our hands on, and those are all Epyc and Ryzen CPUs from all different generations, so Zen 1, 2, and 3. The success times between glitches vary a little bit. We had 30 minutes for Zen 1 and up to 45 minutes for Zen 3, but those definitely could be improved. We didn't put too much work into improving these times because we were more than satisfied with the results we got. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do with those. We executed some payloads instead of the original firmware component. We executed our own components. First of all, one payload that simply prints hello world to the SPI bus, which we can then use to confirm that we actually have code execution. Next of all, we used this access to decrypt some firmware images. Some of the more recent images for the AMD SP have been encrypted, and there's a key in hardware that we can use to decrypt them. And furthermore, we also dumped the read-only memory bootloader so that we can analyze it. All of the code, which is the TNC firmware, together with the scripts that you use on your attacker machine, and all the payloads are available in our GitHub repository with a link down below here. Yes. So now all of these attacks are interesting, allow us to reverse engineer more of the process and attack the SEV ecosystem. The first thing that we can do to attack the SEV ecosystem is replace the SEV application running on the secure processor. So this is a really similar attack instead, just that we didn't replace this PSP FW bootloader component, but we replaced the SEV firmware with our own firmware. And then second, we can dump also some secrets relevant to the SEV remote attestation protocol. Let's go into a little bit more detail. We call it SEV. We are trying to, the goal of SEV is to enable VM customers of a VM service to not trust the hardware owner, to not trust the hypervisor by encrypting the memory and having the remote attestation protocol ensure them that their systems are set up encrypted on some cloud service provider. And a feature that you might want if you're developing for such a system that you might want is to be able to debug your virtual machines. And for that, AMD included a debug decrypt command, which allows the hypervisor to decrypt the VM's memory if that VM has been specially set up to be debuggable. Our replaced firmware component for the SEV application has actually, we disabled this check where the SEV application checks whether or not a hypervisor is allowed to even decrypt the VM. And with this malicious SEV application in place, we can set up a malicious administrator could actually use our attack to set up this SEV application, and then a VM customer could set up a VM that is non-debuggable, but the hypervisor can try to decrypt the VM, and the AMD SP will happily do that, defeating all of the securities provided by the SEV technology. This is, of course, a attack where you need physical access to the system. And if we want some different attack, we might want to attack the remote attestation feature. We call the remote attestation feature is used by customers that want to ensure the VM is actually being set up with SEV in place. So, basically removing the need to trust the hardware owner by having a cryptographic check in place. And this the system works as follows. The AMD SP will first of all set up the VM and then generate a measurement of the whole setup that includes, for example, a hash of the contents of each page, and also includes whether or not the VM is debuggable, for example, and a lot of more information. And this information is then signed with a key called the chip endorsement key, which is accessible only to the AMD Secure Processor. The cloud customer can then retrieve the certificate for this chip endorsement key from AMD's key servers, and using the certificate can validate the signed report, which then proves that the system was set up by a valid AMD Secure Processor. The issue with the system is, of course, if we get access to this chip endorsement key, then we can set up a VM, for example, on some other system like an Intel machine, and then generate the necessary hash measurement, sign it with the extracted key, and send this attestation report to a customer who is then not able to know the difference between this fake report and the real one. So compromising the keys completely breaks the remote attestation feature, which has been a downfall previously because there were some firmware issues in the SEB application, which led to the SEB remote attestation protocol being broken. To fix this issue, AMD introduced the versioned chip endorsement key, of which we will present a simplified version here. The idea is that we don't have one chip endorsement key that can be leaked, but we have multiple chip endorsement keys tied to the versions of specific firmware components. How does this look? So here we have this hierarchy. First of all, the ROM bootloader executes, loads the PSP FW bootloader, and this PSP FW bootloader executes the SEB application. And the ROM bootloader has access to a secret, and all of the next firmware components all have versions. The ROM bootloader uses this version of the PSP FW bootloader to generate a different secret, which is now tied to the version of the second stage bootloader. And the second stage bootloader will also do the same for the SEV application, will encode the version of the SEV application into the secret and only pass that secret on to the SEV application, which then can use the secret to generate a version chip endorsement key, which is now tied to both firmware versions. If an attacker now finds a bug, for example, in the SEV application, then we need to assume the version chip endorsement key and the secret are compromised, and we can't use them anymore. But now what AMD can do is they can publish an updated version of the SEV application with a new version number, which means that there will be a different secret that is passed to this application, which will then generate a different key, which is not compromised. This is a nice system for allowing updates to firmware components, but what if the vulnerability is actually part of the hardware, not of a software component? You recall in our attack, we are able to execute a payload directly after the ROM bootloader, and the ROM bootloader will pass a secret with some version encoded directly to our application, to our payload. And we can actually choose this version that our payload has because it's part of the header of the of the payload that we sign with our custom key. What we can do now is we can dump this key to our attacker machine and generate any version chip endorsement key from that secret. And actually, we can do this attack for any version of our attacker payload, so we can generate all version chip endorsement keys. Additionally, we don't have to execute this attack for every version X of our attacker payload, because there's a nice TCB downgrade feature in the newest standard for the SEB technology. And we can use that to only execute this attack once and then gain access to all version chip endorsement keys. Okay, let's summarize. So we have successfully exploited all Ryzen and Epyc CPUs of the recent CPU microarchitectures, so Zen 1 to Zen 3. We believe Threadripper is also vulnerable, but we haven't tested it yet because we don't have access to any machines right now. And what we did is we gained reliable code execution right after the execution of the ROM bootloader, so at the earliest stage that you can expect to execute anything else than the ROM bootloader. Our attack takes between 30 to 45 minutes, but this can very probably be improved. We used our attack to attack SEV and basically circumvent certain SEV protection mechanisms. In particular, we completely broke SEV's remote attestation protocol, which cannot be assumed to be secure anymore for all of these CPU generations. We believe that firmware TPMs of the Ryzen CPUs will also be compromised by this attack, but we haven't tested this yet. So we'll see if we work on that. And as far as mitigations go, there are no mitigations that AMD could introduce here. To fix this issue, we would need either hardware measurements or we would need modifications to the ROM bootloader, most probably modifications of both components, which can only be done in a future CPU generation. You can read more about all of these attacks in our paper, which is linked at the top here. We also have published all of our code, and this includes the TNC firmware, all the scripts that you need to execute this attack, also the payloads, and also some proof that we actually compromised the chip endorsement keys because we signed the title of our paper with these keys. There's a more complicated attack on SEB, which is the third point here, where we attack the SEV migration feature. And then there's the PSP tool that Robert talked about in the beginning that you can use to analyze UEFI updates. Furthermore, there's an emulator for the AMD SP written using the Unicorn emulator. And there's also a QEMU port that Robert has worked on recently. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. And we have some time for questions now. And you can also send us emails if you have any questions.